Episode 305. Echo-centric episodes are typically fantastic, and The Cost of Living is no exception, as it is a combination of intense, intriguing, and emotional. This episode deals in such themes as repentance and judgment. We are given an initially fascinating and ultimately tragic reunion between Echo and the smoke monster, but before we delve into that, I am first going to discuss the episode's flashback material. Everything we see in regard to Echo's past is deeply centered on Yemi's memory and legacy after we catch a glimpse of the brother's childhood in which Echo is taking great care of his younger sibling. We continue the story featured back in episode 210, the 23rd Psalm. Yemi is recently deceased, so Echo takes over for the late Father Yemi at his church. He ultimately kills a group of horrible, murderous men within the church, emerging from it covered in blood, grasping a large blade, directly in sight of one of the women within the village, who was previously associated with Yemi. She tells Echo that he owes his brother a church due to his desecration of his current one in order to repent, which answers the question as to why Echo spends so much time in season 2 constructing the on-island church. Now let's discuss a rather prevalent concept contained within the show, the rules. The rules are alluded to on a number of occasions. The writers provide you enough info that one can infer a collection of rules and to whom they apply, which is far more creatively satisfying than if the rules were delivered to us in expository fashion, or if we were blandly given the opportunity to read these rules numbered on a list. That's not interesting. While there are rules created millennia ago, such as Mother making it so that Jacob and the Man in Black are unable to fatally harm one another, nor is the Man in Black allowed to kill any of Jacob's candidates. There are also rules that apply to the others, which Ben and Whitmore allude to through a pair of encounters. We learn that island leaders aren't allowed to have children with outsiders, which Ben references as Whitmore is being banished, and if one has been a leader of the others, they aren't allowed to kill another past or present leader or their family members, as when Whitmore's man Kimi kills Alex, Ben states that Charles changed the rules, though it seems to me that the misanthrope Man in Black forged somewhat of a loophole in regard to killing select candidates. The loophole to which I'm referring is the judgment of the smoke monster. I read recently someone complain that this judgment concept is abandoned after this episode, which, if you've watched the series, you know to be false, as episode 512, Dead is Dead, pretty heavily centers on this concept, which is absolutely baked into the lore of the show. And Ben is clearly aware of the ritual, if you will, as in 512. Ben states to quote-unquote Locke that there is a chance the monster may let him live. So again, it is not spoon-fed to us, but rather information is provided to us that leads us to infer that some sort of agreement was made between Jacob and his brother, presumably out of guilt on Jacob's part, which allows this smoke-centric ritual to occur. Now, we know that as a result of this judgment, one either lives or dies, and through the two judgments we witness, we see each of these two options play out. Echo is killed, and Ben survives, and one doesn't need to look too deeply into why that is. I mean, first and foremost, the 512 judgment occurs when the Man in Black / smoke monster is taking the form of Locke in order to influence Ben, but nonetheless there's a distinct contrast in regard to their respective experiences of these judgments. Ben breaks down in tears, evidently remorseful, whilst Echo proudly claims that he has nothing for which to be sorry. Echo certainly was a survivalist hero in regard to the protection of his brother, but if you have viewed the season 2 Echo-centric episodes, you know that at one time he was a notorious drug lord who slit men's throats during coke deals, and for this, Mr. Echo is unrepentant. He sort of speaks as this righteous man who writes that criminal part of his past off, which removes his candidacy, or just simply allows the monster control over his fate. 310. This episode is immensely prevalent to Hugo as a character. For the entirety of the series up until this point, ever since he won the lottery with Jacob's numbers, Hugo has believed that he's surrounded by bad luck, cursed, and 310 documents Hurley's perceived defeat of this curse, with everything having recently gone to Jack is still being held captive by the others. Charlie has just revealed to Hugo Desmond's premonition of his impending death. And after having just discovered an abandoned Dharma bus, Hugo wants to provide himself, along with his fellow survivors, a sense of hope and fun, and try to get the vehicle running. This bus-centric tale provides us with a multitude of wonderful moments. Hugo trying his hand at and failing at Sawyer's nickname game, Sawyer hilariously teaching Jin English, and following the triumph that is Hugo and Charlie essentially confronting and conquering death, our group is able to simply smile and laugh, and for the first time in quite a while, maneuver around in a vehicle. Not only does 310 mark the introduction of the skeletal remains of Roger Linus, who is ultimately, in episode 320, revealed to be Ben's late father, but this piece may very well be the best, most heartwarming depiction of the friendship between Hurley and Charlie, as well as a lovely, atypically lighthearted depiction of this entire group. Trisha Tanaka is Dead really makes you care for these people, makes the big action in the season finales, for example, matter. 314. Before getting into the episode itself, I first wanted to talk about what is perhaps the most objectively disliked pair of characters in the series, Nikki and Paolo. When Oceanic 815 crashed, 40 or so individuals survived, but each season of the series features about 14 to 15 regulars. But I recall throughout the airings of seasons 1 and 2, some of the viewing audience questioned whether or not we'd actually delve into the past of one of these, or some of these background players. This episode delves into Nikki and Paolo's past. We're only physically introduced to them in season 3, but much of the episode focuses on the experience they had throughout the first 2 seasons. A bit gimmicky conceptually, sure, but it's actually really impressively done. Their integration into what are important early touchstones of the series. This is truly a fun, rewatchable, Bonnie and Clyde-esque mystery at its core, leading to this pair being accidentally buried alive. We even get a brilliant reference to the late pair in the final season. Firstly, back in season 4, when Ben was in captivity, Miles attempted to help him out in exchange for $3.2 million. Ultimately, no money changed hands, but nonetheless, Ben was able to escape captivity in the subsequent episode with no payment required. Ben is, once more, in captivity in episode 607. Linus attempts to persuade Miles to help him out in exchange for that $3.2 million he was once after. But Mr. Strom, who can read the final thoughts of the dead, even by just simply nearing their place of burial, doesn't succumb to any sort of financial offer, as he knows Nikki and Paolo are essentially buried beneath him, along with their $8 million worth of diamonds, which he actually acquires by episode's end. This is a fun kind of one-off story in which we witness on-island content throughout the first 70 or so episodes of the series, but from a completely different perspective. It doesn't move the overarching story forward one iota, but a momentous episode and a great or solid episode are simply not always inextricable, and this relatively standalone piece is a prime example of that fact. 407. I've anecdotally read about a few individuals claiming that the sort of tricky structure of Ji-Yeon is a form of narrative cheating. My personal opinion / experience is the antithesis of this. The vast majority of the first trio of seasons features on-island material alongside flashback-centric content. The season 3 finale ultimately surprisingly provides us with flash-forwards, taking place after some of our losties have been rescued. A prevalent storytelling device within primarily the first half of the 4th season is one that is utilized in an episode's beginnings, bearing the intention of making the viewer initially unsure of whether or not a given scene is a flashback or flash forward. 401 plays this game. The opening shot depicts the top of a mango pile, so we assume we're on the island, before Hugo and his Camaro bust through it in the midst of a high-speed pursuit in downtown LA. Then in episode 406, The Other Woman, we momentarily believe that Juliet is one of the rescued losties, as we open in an apparent therapy session where she is referred to as a celebrity, before we quickly learn that Juliet's apparent therapist, Harper, is speaking sarcastically to Dr. Burke, who has been associating with her husband Goodwin not terribly long after Juliet's arrival on the island. This device is utterly brilliant and so distinct to Lost. In episode 407, for so much of the piece, you as a viewer believe that the separate Jin and Sun off-island storylines take place simultaneously subsequent to their rescue, when in reality, Sun's story takes place post-island, while the Jin content turns out to be a flashback, leading us to discover that Jin has apparently perished. This narrative twist in particular is, even though we learn in season 5 that Jin survived the freighter explosion, an exceedingly tragic and brilliant one. 408. Meet Kevin Johnson is an underrated episode, which focuses on an underrated character. I understand a sense of inherent disdain for the character, given that he betrays our heroes after murdering Ana Lucia and Libby, but Michael's whole philosophy is that he's willing to do anything in order to keep his son safe, while Harold Perrineau's performance is perpetually excellent. Not to mention his return here revolves around his desire for redemption. One complaint I read about 408 is that there are issues with the timeline as we learn about what exactly Michael endured throughout his season 3 absence, but I just simply don't see it. I've gone through this series a number of times and no loss like the back of my hand, and never have I been bumped by any sort of timeline issue in Meet Kevin Johnson. I did a bit of research into some problems folks have. Number 1, Tom being off island when he spends much of season 3 on island, as well as number 2, it not adding up that Ben is prepared with freighter info for Michael, but is also surprised by Naomi's arrival on the island and her association with our oceanic survivors. Firstly, we've seen others like Richard and Ethan come and go, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that throughout Tom's recurring role in the first half of season 3, he briefly departed the island via submarine, then flew to New York to see Michael. Not to mention the most important fact here is that time works and acts much differently on island versus off island, which is very well documented throughout the series. So it doesn't make sense to nitpick quote-unquote timeline inconsistencies when said inconsistencies are essentially decided based on real-world centric presumptions made by select fans. I don't quite understand the Ben-centric dispute, as his surprise directed toward the news of Naomi being in the company of our losties has no relation to him being surprised that certain people are coming to the island. He has known this. His surprise is simply due to the fact that he was unaware that she had parachuted onto the island and is now alongside the 815 survivors. One must remind oneself that Ben doesn't have every corner of, well, these 2 islands under surveillance 24/7, so not catching a single parachuter in the dead of night, quite a ways away from the barracks, makes sense. Not to mention the fact that the only reason Des and company were prepared for this parachute-centric situation is because it was foreseen by the psychic Desmond. Okay, besides all that shit, this is an effective piece. I'm definitely a fan of this Michael Dawson redemption arc. I really enjoy the scenes between he and Tom, portrayed by the fabulous MC Gainey, while the final moments are shocking, as we're witness to the abrupt demise of not only Russo, but Carl as well. 505. This Place's Death is, in my opinion, an awesome episode through and through, and like episode 115 entitled Homecoming, which I discussed in part 1, it kind of surprised me to see 505 rather low in a couple different episode rankings at which I looked. Now, back in the latter part of season 1, Russo alluded to her arrival on the island, her team's mysterious infection, as well as her former colleague Montand losing his arm, occurring 16 years prior. Given that Danielle's shocking demise during episode 408's conclusion initially led me to believe that we would never witness a Russo flashback episode, it is especially bloody brilliant that the writers were able to ultimately organically depict her eventful past via time travel. Now, allow me to briefly explain why the time travel heavy 5th season is by no means out of the blue or some sort of desperate jump-the-shark-esque decision. It's quite the opposite, actually. Time travel is basically immediately placed on the audience's radar. Let's go season by season. In season 1, Charlie mentions the fact that the island turns from day to night rather quickly, featuring Jekyll and Hyde-esque weather. At the end of episode 213, Hugo and Saeed are in possession of a radio whilst on the beach. Saeed states that the device could be picking up a signal from thousands of miles away, could be from anywhere. Then Hurley states, or from any time, before claiming to be kidding. Then the episode ends. A very intriguing inclusion by the writers. 308, entitled Flashes Before Your Eyes, is a fantastic episode which nearly entirely depicts the time traveling of Desmond's consciousness. Then we experience almost a season's worth of the great Mr. Hume's premonitions. Season 4's nearly universally acclaimed The Constant perfected this concept of consciousness time travel, as we're gifted this emotional, mind-bending piece in which a younger Des is forced to visit Professor Faraday at Oxford University in 1996. Then we get a taste least, even if we as an audience were initially not entirely aware of it, of time traveling in episode 411, Cabin Fever, when an unaging Richard Alpert visits a hospital in the 50s to see a newborn John Locke. We witness a Dharma orientation video in the season 4 finale, after which a facetious but truthful Ben assures Locke that it did in fact revolve around the concept of time-traveling bunnies. It is in this same episode that the island is moved, and although it is not handed to you in expository fashion, I think any religious viewer of this series would infer that this movement of the island is more than just solely a physical affair. Now, the final component of this piece I'll be discussing is all of the Locke-centric material at the bottom of a well. Not only is this underground sequence exceedingly and effectively eerie, it is also an absolutely prevalent part of Lost's narrative, as well as the Man in Black's nefarious plot. I adore the creepy set and wicked wheel prop, as well as the pitch-perfect performances from both Terry O'Quinn and John Terry. All the while, Giacchino's score is typically fitting and exquisite. Let's speak specifically of the Man in Black's grand plan and its timeline. As we learn, the Man in Black is not allowed to fatally harm Jacob or his candidates. All the while, he is desperate to leave the island on which he's been trapped his entire life, but Jacob's lifelong goal is to keep his brother from leaving. We witness the original Man in Black, played by Titus Welliver, state in the season 5 finale that he is going to find a loophole to be able to kill Jacob. But of course, MIB's plan is set into motion a while before we view this excellent flashback. In episode 411, the trio of John, Ben, and Hugo visit Jacob's cabin, though only Locke goes inside. The monster, disguised as Christian Shepherd, informs John that he must move the island. In the ending portion of this place's death, John states to Christian that he did what was asked of him, but Christian disagrees, reminding John that he told him Locke himself must move the island, while Benjamin Linus was the man to turn the wheel. Locke, who had already been told by Richard whilst he was traveling through time in episode 501 that his journey would consist of his own death, accepts this suicide mission presented to him by Christian, as Smokey states that John's act of bringing the Oceanic Six back to the island involves his sacrifice. This mind-bending confusion is resolved later in season 5, when we actually witness Flock inform Richard to relay this message of sacrifice to a time-traveling Locke. It was always the Man in Black, disguised as another of course, instigating this plot. Now what does this particular action do for the villainous Man in Black? Jacob's off-island candidates are brought back to the island for him to indirectly kill, so that he can finally leave this prison of an island, their deaths being a prerequisite for doing so, while he is given the corpse of John Locke to inhabit. Why inhabit John? Because he is the one and only individual capable of persuading Ben to kill Jacob. All of this to say, the creepy and captivating underground sequence is imperative to the Man in Black's plot, which becomes more and more engrossing to me upon my rewatches of this series. It's very interestingly, mind-bendingly, and gradually handled in Lost's 4th and 5th seasons.